Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining our didactic today. That's focused on a global perspective on the ethical conduct of research. Before we get started, we would appreciate it if you could type in this link into your laptop or phone. That will take you to a poll everywhere that will have questions pertaining to material from our didactic. And you can answer those questions as you go along and listen to the didactic. And just make sure to fill out this poll everywhere within the next 25 to 30 minutes before our discussion on it. And as a quick reminder to move on to the next question, press next at the top right-hand corner and then submit at the end when you're finished.
Thank you, Nina. So I'm going to keep that slide up just for a minute more because I know my name is a little confusing. Okay, so we also got it in the handout of it, just in case you didn't get it. We have a group of panelists out here who have been working on this topic for more than a couple of months now. Unfortunately, due to the restrictions with Zoom, we couldn't get some of the panelists in, but we'll try our best to speak for them. So we have myself, Vijaya A.Kumar, Associate Director of the Global Health Research Collaborative and Vice Chair of IRB, MP2 at Wayne State. We have Simone French, who's a Program Director, DM at Emergency Medicine, University of West Indies. We have Tej Prakash Sinha, the Chief Coordinator of the World Health Organization Collaborative Center at All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Nina Entcheva, School of Public Health, has been from University of Michigan. We have Sorapat VIjitakula, Director, Social Emergency Medicine Fellowship, University Hospitals Cleveland Medical Center. Eveline Hitti, who's the Chairperson of Emergency Medicine at American University of Beirut Medical Center, and James Paxton, who's the Director of Clinical Research, Data Receiving Hospital, Wayne State University. Thank you for being here today. Our agenda, none of us have any disclosures. Our agenda for today is explain, by the end of the session, we hope that we are able to explain how ethics governance for clinical research varies globally, describe variations in application of research ethics concepts and why such differences exist, understand the ethical challenges faced in conducting research in LMICs, and identify opportunities to improve application of research ethics. So I'm going to start with a couple of slides here. We did do a global ethics survey, and this is how it all started. We did this survey around 6 months ago. We asked a few questions. There were around 10 questions. And we'll put the questions up at the end of the session so that you'll get an idea. So we asked how strictly are the recommendations made by the IRB committee, and 100% said to the T. So in any part of the world, it was the same answer. And then we had some differences with like what happens if studies are not submitted to the committee. We're surprised that some of them actually from some parts of the said nothing happens and they can still go ahead with their study, and which was actually surprising. And then the rest of them said what we expected, unable to publish, and the other one is unable to conduct the study. The other thing that was surprising was we asked whether there's an equivalent to the EFIC, which is exception from informed consent, in around the world, and 75% of them said there's no equivalent. So, and that was pretty surprising. And how long is the approval period? I think that varied from 1 year to 3 years. So this is just an example of what the similarities and differences, and that got us thinking. And then we got this group together who started working on the different concerns that are there with ethics around the world. And you can see that with this diagram that there's a lot of concerns that are out there. We're going to try to hit in some of them. And what we'd like to start off in the beginning is actually give us a little background of how truly the ethics was begun and the history behind it and where we are right now, and in the US sense. And Dr. Paxton will go ahead with that.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. How do you advance the slides? Is it just the clicker?
Yeah.
I'm Dr. James Paxton, Director of Research at Detroit Receiving Hospital, and previous chair of the IRB at Wayne State. I'll talk a little bit about research ethics, and I'm going to acknowledge up front that a lot of this is Americocentric, because that's what I'm most familiar with, but we're going to talk about a lot of other takes on research ethics as we go forward in the talk. But I think in general terms, ethics has been defined in many ways, but the one that seems to speak to me the most is that it is a personal code of conduct which is based on respect for oneself, others, and one's surroundings. And it's governed by moral principles or assumptions about the way that we should conduct ourselves. Should, in quotes. So someone has decided how we should conduct ourselves. Research ethics, more specifically, is the application of these ethical principles to research activities, and it applies to really all aspects of research design and execution, so including resources and how scientists conduct themselves professionally. And there are really four main principles of ethical research, and these have been kind of agreed upon as the underlying tenets of research ethics, and they are beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. And put simply, and these are complicated concepts, you could write a book about each one of them, but put simply, beneficence is to do good, non-maleficence is to do no harm, autonomy is to respect the individual's right to make their own decisions, and justice is to be fair and equitable in your selections of not only people to be subjects for research, but also how the research is conducted. And unfortunately, researchers are bad people. Historically. So no one in this room, of course, is, but if you look back in history, you'll see plenty of examples of people who called themselves researchers who did things that were definitely unethical by today's standards and most likely considered unethical by the previous standards. In the Middle Ages, vivisection was common, so people could be dissected while alive. This was usually prisoners or people that were considered bad. And sometimes they were injured just to see what would happen. Like, what is the natural course of an injury and how does that progress towards death? During World War II, this is one of the more commonly known examples of research crimes in which the Nazis and also the Japanese were doing human experiments on prisoners of war and other individuals that they did not feel were I guess you could say it was not needed to consent them or to treat them humanely. And so these pictures at the bottom just show some examples of some of the things you'll see in the media, in the history books about the kinds of things that were being done during that time. So at the end of World War II, as many of you know, there was something called the Nuremberg Code, which was developed in response to these atrocities. And so the research community recognized that these type of activities were wrong. But one of the things that the German researchers brought up in their defense was that there were no agreed upon rules about what was ethical and what was not ethical. And so they didn't feel they did anything wrong because nobody had told them that it was wrong to do these things. And so the Nuremberg Code was really the first generally accepted international code of conduct which governed the ethical aspects of human research. And before this time, some countries had guidelines and rules, but it was never agreed upon internationally, and this was the first example of that, which has been built upon in subsequent years. In 1948, the year after, the Declaration of Geneva was adopted by the World Medical Association at its second annual meeting, and this really builds upon the traditional Hippocratic Oath and just kind of, I guess you could say, updates it and also gives it a different scope. It's a declaration of physicians' dedication to humanitarian goals of medicine, but it can be equally applied to research. In '64, the Declaration of Helsinki was taking things a step further. This was the first effort by the medical community to self-regulate research. Prior to that, it was being done on individual local bases, and this was the first effort to really regulate on a international level. Some of the most important principles that were defined and introduced by the Declaration of Helsinki included the idea of permitting proxy consent. So in other words, that it didn't have to be the subject themselves to provide consent for research. It could be a relative or someone else. This document honored patients' rights as being more important than society's interests, which is an incredibly important part of our modern concept of ethical research, that we respect individuals. Even when society's interests may conflict, the individual wins. And they also recommended that some kind of independent committee should regulate research. And in the United States, they're called institutional review boards, often. In other countries, they have different names for them. But this was one of the first examples of a attempt to define these independent committees that should be overseeing research. They also said that it was important to consent minors when you were engaging them in research, which was a kind of a novel concept at the time, to ask permission from young people to do research on them. It seems kind of intuitive now, but this was a groundbreaking document in many ways. And this was adopted by the WMA at their 18th General Assembly some years later after the previous in Helsinki. Now we're going to go from the international scale to the national scale, talk a little bit about the United States and our evolution in terms of our national research infrastructure. So in 1974, there was a law that was passed, which was the National Research Act of 1973. President Nixon signed it in '74. And the reason that this law was developed and subsequently approved was really in response to some of the American atrocities, not specific to the Nazis or the Japanese things that we discussed earlier, but more things that had been going on in our own country. And one of the more prominent examples is the Tuskegee study, which we won't go into today, but I'm sure you've all heard about. And whether or not you know about it, I think the idea here is that unethical research is not limited to other countries. We've done things ourselves as Americans, which have been considered unethical by today's standards. And so this was an attempt to regulate as well. This act authorizes the federal agencies, such as the NIH, the FDA, to develop regulations that govern how human subjects research occurs. And it requires institutions to form IRBs to review and oversee research, to approve and make sure that the research is being conducted ethically and appropriately. So the Belmont Report followed 5 years later, and this was written by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This was developed at the Belmont Center in Elk Ridge, Maryland, which is why it's called the Belmont Report. This took things another step further and talked about the boundaries between biomedical and behavioral research and routine practice of medicine. So one of the important concepts we talk about in research is this standard of care or is this research activity? And this was one of the first examples of a document attempting to define the difference between those concepts. They also discussed the role of the assessment of the risk-benefit criteria, which is an important concept in consenting subjects that, we want to explain to them the risks and the benefits so they can make a decision that's based upon an understanding of those things. Also, it provided appropriate guidelines for the selection of human subjects for participation in research, and it defined informed consent so that we would have a standardized definition of that going forward. More recently, in 1981, the Common Rule was introduced, and it's called the Common Rule because it provides common governance for all of our American U.S. federal agencies that engage in human subjects research. The FDA is somewhat excluded from that, but they have their own rules, and things are kind of converging as we move forward in time as well. These are requirements for assuring compliance. These are requirements for obtaining and documenting consent, and requirements for how IRBs function. And so they're very mechanical and structural, but it does provide a lot of guidance for individuals who are regulating research on the local level. Have any of you been on an IRB or involved extensively with an IRB? Okay, awesome. So you already know that IRBs essentially function to protect research subjects. That's human research subjects. That is really the primary function of an IRB. There are a lot of specific roles and functions that IRB members do serve, but the primary overriding purpose is to protect research subjects. And the modern concept of ethical treatment of patients participating in research is really a natural evolution of all of these events and many more, as well as the regulatory things that have been developed in our country and globally to protect subjects. And so IRBs are meant to kind of inherit those principles and then apply them to the conduct of research. There are many types of IRB approval. I put this in really more to demonstrate the differences. So those of you familiar with IRB already know that there are full board reviews, which are really like requiring the entire review committee. And then there are expedited, which may be accelerated, but may still require some review by the IRB. Studies can be exempt, which means the IRB has reviewed the study and determined that it's not, does not require IRB oversight. And then there are other ways of having IRB approval, including humanitarian use device and off-label use, compassionate use devices. We won't get into that, but the point is that there are lots of ways the IRB can approve a study and lots of ways that studies can be done using IRB approval. So waiver of consent is an important concept here because we talked before, in fact, Dr. Kumar mentioned that exception from informed consent is not a global universal concept. It's something that's not unique to the United States, but certainly more common here than in some other countries. And this permits, under the Common Rule, the ability to screen and also, in some cases, enroll subjects in studies without their informed consent. It is used most commonly to screen patients for research studies, typically for retrospective, but also for prospective research. But then EFIC being the extreme example of a case where you can gain permission from the IRB to enroll subjects without their advanced consent, although you still do typically try to obtain their consent afterwards. With that, I'll turn it over. I think Dr. Kumar is going to cover Dr. French's section, so thank you for your time.
Thank you, James. So I think that was needed, I think, just to get an overview of what ethics in research is from our perspective from the US. So now going to the crux of our presentation is ethics in LMIC. So what we decided was we'll choose one of the countries where research is conducted to quite an extent, and then talk about how the ethics process happens in that country, and then see the similarities and differences and go. So Dr. Simone, who's a director for research at UV, prepared these slides. Unfortunately, she's not being able to be here. But Jamaica is an English-speaking country. It's an upper middle-income country. It used to be middle income. Right now, it's an upper middle. It has a population of nearly 3 million. There are around 23 local hospitals and 19 emergency departments which fall under the medical health association, and there is the one University of West Indies where Dr. Simone comes from. They have a graduate program in emergency medicine, and the MONA Council of Research Ethics Committee is the council which is out there. So you can see the diagram out here. So MONA campus, where the faculty of UV is, when they conduct the research, they have to do, if it's only the faculty and their research, community research, then they can go to their ethics review. But if it involves any of these 23 hospitals, they actually have to go to the Ministry of Health ethics committee too. So you have two ethics committees, one's in the local ethics committee, which is the hospital ethics committee, and then you have the Ministry of Health ethics committee, which has to review all your applications. So last year's 2021, MCREC reviewed around 346 human studies, of which 238 got approved, two got aborted, and a substantial portion, around 1/4 of them, had to be resubmitted. So the reason we put this slide up here is to show that they do a lot of reviews. It's not a board which doesn't do. They do a significant amount, and there is like 1/4 of them land up not being accepted. And when they get resubmitted, the turnaround time for that gets longer because the scrutiny is more. And it seems that if they get resubmitted, they sometimes need to go to the Ministry of Health because there is a reason why it got held back. So Ministry of Health needs to review it. So even if it was a study which did not involve any of the 23 local hospitals and 19 emergency departments, they have to go back to Ministry of Health. So you can see that the stepwise pattern that review is done is pretty strict. And why is it like that? And I think the answer for that is because of a lot of studies which were done in the mission model. A lot of people, a lot of academicians used to go to countries like Jamaica and be able to conduct research a little bit more easily till a lot of problems were found out. And so they made this two-tier process, makes it difficult now for research to be conducted by international bodies unless they go through their IRB, their method. So some of the ethical concerns which have been growing over time, I'm just going to mention and talk a little bit about each one of them. The first one is ethics dumping. So what's ethics dumping? So ethics dumping is like if you have a study which our IRB board, or I'll use the word global north and global south. It just makes it a little bit more relevant now. So which the global north has refused, is then pushed down to the global south, where the ethics the level of review is much simpler, and they managed to get it approved in those places and conduct the study in those places. So it's happened before. So ethics dumping has happened in the Jamaican perspective. Helicopter research is another name is mission or colonial research, where basically the academicians from global north go conduct research in the global south, take the results of the global south, and then publish it in the global north and get their career upgrade, so move to the next step. Authorship studies are done. And then the first author, last author is not provided to your partners, and they're given some middle authorship, and I think that's happened quite a bit. Consent process, again, as James mentioned, waiver of consent has become almost impossible now, even sometimes with expedited study. There have been, because the patients sometimes don't understand, even if it's a simple study, they want the patient's consent. So it becomes much more difficult to get the consent process through. And I think sometimes it becomes difficult when you're collaborating with UV to understand why the consent process is required. But there is a reason why the consent process has been put there for many cases. Insurance of a trial subject, and this came up in COVID, and it's also been seen in other pharmaceutical study, is like if something happens to the trial subject, like what then? Like what is the safeguard put for the trial subject? And that has been an issue of content. Post-trial access and distributive justice, I think James mentioned, I think that's one of the key elements of conducting research, is like you should be able to go back to the community if you're doing a study. And sometimes it's been seen that that does not happen. You do the study, and even with academicians from West Indies, Simone said that they themselves don't do distributive justice and don't let it trickle down to the community, the results of their study. Even when it comes to the results of the study, it's put in open access journals, which becomes difficult for the cost for people, for faculty from low middle income countries to be able to afford to put it into open access journals. So even that small thing is a little bit difficult. And post-trial monitoring, I think that's an issue we have here too. So I think, like, how do we follow these patients? And that's been seen in the Jamaican perspective. So these are some of the ethical concerns that have been there. And the experience that they have with their ethics approval is, as you can see, with the multi-step process and the stringent way of ethics out there, there's a significant amount of delay in the ethical approval process that happens out there. So you can see out here with the chart that 54% of them were full committee, 21% of them were expedited, and only 1% were exempt. Almost like 99% of them needed to go through some sort of a board. Very minimal were exempt. So there is institutional variation in ethical approval of research, as you can see. So even though MONA and the Ministry of Health tries to govern most of the studies, sometimes what happens is they get approval from international bodies and the global IRBs, and they're able to bypass this and able to conduct the study in a community or in a hospital which is not one of the main hospitals. And they try to, and then they manage to submit it. And if it comes to the notice of MONA or the Ministry of Health, it's held back. So, and it has happened that studies have been done and gone forward with the collaborations without the approval of MONA and the Ministry of Health, which is an issue. And again, post-trial monitoring has been minimal. So regarding how the ethics committee is, it's very similar to what our ethics committee is out here in the US. You have a chair, and the chair is usually a trained faculty, and in this case is a pro-vice chancellor of research. And then they have representatives from each of the campuses, and then they have a legal counsel, and then they have pro-vice chancellor of graduate study, and then you have two community representatives, very similar to what we have. One is a clergy, and one is a lay person. So, and I think it's important that they do use that same mechanism so that they get a perspective from the lay person and gets their perspective, protected their interests. It's a volunteer position, and that makes it really difficult. Everybody is volunteer, and it does take a lot of time. So because it's volunteer, it makes it difficult for them to commit and get it done quickly. They have to do it on their own time. The minimum requirement is CD training. Okay, and what are the experience with research? I think two big things that they have is the mission-driven research, I think, has been strong out there. And that's the same thing as the helicopter research or the colonial research. I think it has been there. It's even prevalent now. According to Simone, a lot of the partners come and do the research and then go back and don't have a sustainable effort in the country, which is a problem. Therapeutic misconception is a term that's used. It's basically where they are differentiating the role of the clinician and the researcher. And sometimes, since most of the researchers are truly clinicians in Jamaica, it becomes difficult for them to get into the mindset of true research. And if, like in the example of a randomized control, if they have the patient in the placebo arm, it becomes difficult for the researcher as a clinician to allow this to proceed, and sometimes goes around the study and goes ahead and treats the patient because he just can't accept ethically that we're going to go ahead with a placebo arm for this patient. So there's a therapeutic misconception that happens. So after this, we're going to go ahead with Dr. Pat and Sorapat, and he's going to talk about the perspective from the high-income countries about studies in low-income countries. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Arun. I'll just stand over here as well. Oh, and the clicker, which is the button here. So again, my name is Pat VIjitakula. I wanted to take the time to kind of talk about doing global health research from a perspective of going to establish a partnership from a high-income country like the United States to LMIC, what my experience and what my colleagues I've seen in the field have to consider. So, I mean, when you start with research, we always ask, what is the research question, right? And I remember in grad school when I got my MPH, my professor was like, okay, so what if you're studying a biological study, getting blood samples, what factors determine how much blood you can get, or how? And I raised my hand and said, whatever the patient can provide. And he's like, no, that's actually the second factor. Number two, the first factor is how much do I need to make my study go? And, in the United States, that might be a benign question where giving blood is appropriate. But then if you think about it, when you're trying to establish a partnership with countries or partners with less resources, you have to realize who's benefiting. All right, is it the researchers or the actual patients that you're trying to help and increase medical knowledge? And it's also, is it culturally appropriate? For example, I was involved with the HIV prevalence study in Zambia among migrant farm workers. We were talking about getting blood tests for HIV. That seemed very simple. I spent most of my time trying to convince them that we weren't using the blood for satanic purposes, because they were asked, if I want to be removed from the study, how can I not get my blood back? And so these are kind of things, to us, benign. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, in Thailand, if you look at some of the surveys in Thailand, the participation rates are almost like 100%. That's culturally to say you're supposed to agree with the physician, you're just doing good. You might not want to do it, but culturally that's what you say yes to. And so you have this wide spectrum of what is ethical, what's appropriate culturally. And then we can go back, I'm Thai, so American, but even studying HIV in Thailand, public health, it was a great study to decrease HIV rates among commercial sex workers, because that was understood in Thai culture that they need money, there's a financial component, but then the IV drug users were considered, had stigma, so that their HIV rates still was elevated. So even within the country, we have to understand what we're trying to study and the cultural appropriateness of it. And who defines the ethics? James did a great job presenting ethics and what that is, but usually a lot of times when we're working from a high-income country, we're working with the people in power locally who have gotten there in many ways. It could be democratic elected, it could be a coup that they came, a military junta taking over. So they might not be as protective of the minorities, people who are discriminated. And then what are the values? What are the views of research in general? A lot of times, research is viewed as a luxury in many low-income countries, and you're just adding another thing on the people on the ground, another job to do, probably not as much paid too. So those are kind of things we want to think about as we're trying to formulate partnerships abroad. And there's definitely, obviously, a power dynamic that we have the resources, and often when we in an attempt to to bring voice to those who are vulnerable, we end up focusing on the vulnerable population in whatever country we're at. And so, again, you're asking someone who, in another country, to see if you can study their vulnerable population. And if something goes bad, there's really no accountability. We're funded in the US. The the people are already marginalized in their own community. And there's also bias of what we can actually study or their stereotypes. And so those are kind of things that we consider. And political and structural instability, roads collapse, political power changes, not even in the government, but also within organizations that you may be working for. Leadership changes, ideas change, priorities changes. And that all affects your research timeline and limit the resources like the supply chain that actually come to study to conduct a study. And we mentioned discrepancy in data approval. I mean, you heard in Jamaica, the West Indies, there's a huge discrepancy in a lot of bureaucracy getting data approval. But then I've been in places where I know the Ministry of Health in Congo, we just walk in, he stamps the thing, and we're done. So there's two extremes, right? And so those aren't always the ideal ways either, but understand what IRB, or how we get the approval for data is important. So what can we do? It's a tough question. Time is the essence. And fortunately, when we're coming from like the United States, we get like a 1-month block to do research in whatever country of our choosing. We fly in, even if we're working with people who've been there before, but the people on the ground don't know like us, like personally when we're on the ground. And so it takes time. You have multiple trips. You got to plan for those and build relationships. When I was in the Azraq in the Syrian refugee camp, I was there for 4 months. First thing I did was sit there for a month and realize that what they needed. And all it was they were getting hammered for triage. People were screaming. They weren't seeing fast enough. So I just bought a wall clock. I just put it on the bus, put it on the wall so they can write down when they checked in, when they got discharged. And then I got street cred from that. Then I could just do any quality study, whatever project I wanted. I mean, it was just simple. We'll always buy like a $10 clock. Now, again, then you have to set up the IRBs. Again, that's always very tricky of who you talk to. It takes time to figure that out. It's time consuming if it's already in the process. Now, one way that has helped me to get around that was to get buy-in with quality projects. And that's also a double-edged sword in that people want to be shown that they're doing a good job. So you're doing a study, if you're too honest and there's some weaknesses, people get very defensive that shut down. And you don't have to go through the IRB process. It's like a quality, it's showing a concrete example of how research can actually help your work. And I think a lot of people, myself included, when we go initially, we're like, oh yeah, I got this amazing training, I know stats, I know how to do, update on the latest literature. But again, it's important to see yourself as more an advisor. It's just kind of like, this is what I've done, this is what I think, but you guys are the experts. Let me help you and empower them. And the other thing is, the last thing I wanted just to say is that familiarize yourself with remote technology, different data analysis. Everyone has a cell phone now, so they're probably more used to it than we are in many cases. And so I think, and also using the right software that doesn't use a lot of bandwidth, like not a lot of Zoom calls with international folks, for example. So that's kind of what my thoughts are, and my experience is kind of as from us going to do establishing partnerships abroad. And then I'm doing my best here to sub for Dr. Hitti, equity, paradox, and research ethics. They kind of overlap, so I'll do my best there. A majority of the worldwide preventable diseases burden are in the LMICs, the low middle income countries. But the research, however, is in places like the United States, high income countries. And in fact, diseases of relevance to HIC high income countries are 7 to 8 times more trials than the lower income countries. And on top, so most of the studies are done in places like the United States for our diseases that we care about. And then on top of that, the next bullet point, some of our studies to cut costs are done in other countries for stuff that we're interested in. So, the reasons are full. You have a larger disease burden of whatever disease you're studying. So your power, your numbers quickly, you can do it cheaper. Probably, I think the study that was on this paper was like a 10th at the same high level quality in India, for example. And so there's lack of context for LMICs. People, we can have the ICU guidelines, but then, we don't have an ICU or a ventilator. Again, when I was, again, my experience we would have an ICU, we were like, well, we can intubate, but then what do we do with them after we intubate them? So something to think about. So research doesn't always equal the global population needs. Again, to drive it home more, there's resource here that, the 1090 gap that you may have heard, it's 90% of the resource, well, resources are about 10% of the population, or less than 10% of the population, or less than 10% of the resources are used for 90% of the population disease burden. And there is a bias for more Western publications and to get international standards. So if you work locally in your own area, of the people that your own country, you might not be respected globally because you're not published in a Western journal. And if you are able to publish in Western journals and have the ability, you end up moving away, causing the brain drain. I have colleagues in Thailand who are publishing in Annals, and they're actually here in Canada doing a master's and doing something. They're not practicing emergency medicine in Thailand. Human subject research regulations, and just again, more bureaucracy and organization on the national level. And for HSPs, the human subjects protections, and LMICs, there's all these guidelines, international guidelines, local guidelines, society guidelines, institutional IRBs, and sectional, scientific journals, excuse me. And they have to navigate through that. It takes resources, one, but also if you notice, if you're in the United States, a lot of our international guidelines, scientific journals, IRBs are kind of blended together. So the shift in culture is not as much as in maybe in other countries with lower the LMICs. And again, the complexity of marrying local and international laws, regulations, like just consent, understanding consent, or even the lack of waivers of emergency consent laws are not clear, even though that it may be supported. So these are, Eveline kind of highlighted the cost, the training that's needed, the legal guidance, the indemnities, for compensation for people's time, organization, infrastructure, the review committee, and then the continuing review of what's been done, and the data privacy and protection all delay the process of approval. Like you think saw earlier, that it can take years if you don't pass all these bars. So in conclusion, trying to balance between the protection and minimizing costs and reducing bureaucracy will help hopefully lower the gap. And speaking from a United States physician, researcher, it's kind of tough to help, but that's kind of what we're hoping to do. All right, I think that's the end of mine slides, and back to Arjun here.
Thank you, Pat. I think that actually was a really important area that we would like to focus on, is the paradox of resources and being able to conduct research. So, who decides this governance globally, and why is it that they should decide what the governance is for research in LMICs or the Global South? I think that's going to be the context of this next section. So what is the current landscape of global ethics? I think WHO in 2000 came up with the definition of ethical committees. They're responsible for acting in full interest of potential research participants and concerned communities, taking into account the interests and needs of researchers and relevant regulations and applicable laws. That was said by WHO. And who governs the ethics globally? I think you have a number of bodies who are involved with that. You have the DHS in the US Department of Health and Human Services. They have CIMS. So CIMS is Council for International Organization of Medical Sciences. They're actually one of the key institutes that now govern, formed from WHO and UNESCO, so in 1949. So WHO, World Health Organization, as you know, UNESCO, United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization. Then you have World Medical Association, who came up with the Declaration of Helsinki, as Dr. Paxton had mentioned. So these are the main bodies. I don't see anyone from the Global South out here. I think it looks like it's a very strong Global North representation, and the ideas and the definitions are all set by the Global North. So this is CIMS, and I think this is one of the most important organization right now, which runs the ethics. And the last guidelines came out in 2016. So they come up with the guidelines every decade or so. So the one before that was in 2008. 2016. They include 45 international, 18 U.S. member organizations designed to define national policies on ethics of biomedical research involving human subjects. Specific aims is to reflect conditions and needs of low-resource countries and implication for multinational or transnational research partnerships. The new version, which adds the children or minors and people who are unable to provide informed consent as vulnerable individuals, and broaden scope of research covered by guidelines from biomedical to health-related. Again, you can see out here, like it's all defined and made and created by the Global North for ethical research being conducted in the Global South. So, and that's a pattern that we see. As we did our literature review, we went through a bunch of studies that are out there and try to figure out, like, is there representation? And we found, like, maybe a couple of studies about trying to improve the representation from the Global South, one from Egypt, I think one from India. So who are the ultimate responsible parties? So ultimate responsible party at the end of it all is the investigator when you do research. So it all boils down to the investigator who's conducting the research, and the other responsible parties like institutional industry sponsors, if it's human investigational committees, ethical review boards are responsible. If it's in a journal, the peer reviewers are responsible. If it's published, then journal editors, publisher, and the scientific community at whole. But at the end of it, it's truly the investigator who's responsible for his study. Again, there are a number of challenges. I think we went through a bunch of them. The risk-benefit assessment and standard of care for participants with elevated baseline risk. Again, this is different when you look at it from an LMIC's perspective, and when you look at it from a US perspective or a Global North perspective. The risk-benefit assessment is completely different. Blurring of roles of clinician and researchers, I think it's become much more relevant in the Global South, because in the Global North, I think that your role is almost pretty well defined as a clinician or research, but in the Global South, the role actually blends pretty strongly. There's absence of a tradition of peer review and community advocacy, and I think that's very present in the Global South. There's population with intersecting vulnerabilities, which are seen. Again, fair participation selection is a problem. I think all of us know, like when we conduct studies, sometimes in the Global South, the true consent is not obtained. It's a group consent sometimes. So there's a village head or somebody who can give consent for the whole group, and everybody accepts it because they have accepted. So it's truly not individual consent. So it's truly difficult to say fair participation selection. Quality of consent, again, as I was saying, it can be varied. And lack of financial support and resources. I think it boils down to why does the Global South want to do collaborative research with the Global North? It's because of funding. There's no funding in the Global South. It's the Global North which has the funding to be able to conduct research. And so then the Global South relies on the Global North for direction and also guidelines when it comes to ethics and other aspects of research. So these are the important questions to ask. So who's commissioning the research? So I think that's very important. Like at the bottom line, whoever's commissioning the research has an agenda behind commissioning the research. I think it's very important to ask that question. Who owns the data? I think that's really, in this day and age, data is money. So who owns the data? So I've seen a lot of collaborative research, and they want to see that the data center is in the Global North. Why is the data center not in the Global South? I think the answer to that is, from the Global North, is they don't rely on the confidentiality or the capability of the Global South to protect the data. So, but that's not strong enough. How will the findings be used? I think who decides how the findings will be used? How will the community benefit from research? So that's the distributive justice. I think these are very important questions when you do collaborative research with your partners, is answering these questions and taking the perspective of your partners into view. And when you're from the Global South also, these questions are really important when you're partnering with the Global North. I think with that, I'll move on to a small section which was put together by Dr. Sinha, and he's the WHO Collaborative Center in India, and he has been trying a lot to develop the Global South as an area where they would be able to come up with their own guidelines for ethics. So I did want to talk about two things that James brought up. One is the exception from informed consent in the global sphere. So even though, from his perspective, in India, they don't have anything like EFIC, even though trauma is so the cardiac arrest, emergency medicine has been there for 20 years now, but EFIC is still not present. So conducting research on cardiac arrest or conducting research on personnel who are unable to give consent is almost impossible out there. And they have such a large resource of this population, but still unable to do research. So there has to be some changes made to develop that. Again, governance of research in LMICs, MICs, and LICs, I think that's a important point. So again, the governance, as I said, like who are the governance bodies now? WHO, UNESCO, CIMS. There's no representation from the region which truly matters and want to do the research. So I think there should be more governance in LMICs, MICs, and LICs, or representation or bodies from them. So what are the future direction? Bringing diverse EM researchers together to engage in conversations surrounding research. I think and this is the first step. We managed to get you all together, and I think just put the seed in to think about there needs to be something done to help improve the representation of the Global South in research ethics. Standardization of ethics globally in EM research. Since we are EM physicians, I think our first aim is to develop EM research. Ease in conducting research in compliance with the Belmont Report and form local governance. I think that's really critical. Like a lot of places are like Jamaica and India, where the bureaucracy and the ability to conduct research depends on their tertiary centers. And I think there should be a way in which, even following the Belmont Report, we should be able to conduct research with compliance. And it should be stemming from their centers rather than us dictating what needs to be done. And what are our next steps? I think we came up with a few of these points that we thought would be good next steps. I think create a working group on improving ethics and compliance. I think ethics compliance. So working group would be not only the Global North, but mainly involving the Global South and with help from the Global North. Making ethics less stringent, but still compliant with the Belmont Report, and developing a checklist that would be minimum requirements for conducting research in LMS. So these are thoughts that Dr. Tej Prakash put forward, and I do think that those are good first steps to move forward. I think that sort of sums up what we had to say today. I know it's a short time to cover a lot, but I think what we do want you to do is think about this, and then let us know if we will be starting the working group, and let us know if you want to be a part of the working group and moving forward. So Nina is going to go ahead and just go through the poll everywhere.
So now I'm going to just go through the questions that were on the poll everywhere. Here, the correct answer for this one was maleficence. And then for the next one, it was to protect research subjects. And then, yep, here, everyone got this one right, too. Emergent conditions where consent would be impossible. Looks like everyone got this one, too. That it's healthcare mission teams. And then, yeah, this one was all of the above as well. And then for this one, the correct answer was intellectual ability. It looks like some people did put brain drain. And then for this one, the correct answer was the CDC, for who is not involved in the global governance of ethics. And then for what challenges do we face in global ethics, the answer was all of the above. And then this one was more of a discussion question, but it looks like we were split between that the governance of global EM research should originate from LMICs or the World Health Organization.
I think let's stop at that. Mm-hmm. We have like a few minutes. 10 minutes? It's not even. Okay. So just a couple of minutes. I think this is actually a really important discussion point. Like WHO and UNESCO are the ones, the governing body, and we do feel that WHO and UNESCO should be involved. But I think I'm just going to open out there. Why is there a thought that LMICs and MICs should not be involved in that? Is there any thought
answer is exactly what's up there. It should be both. It should be a collaborative effort, and it should be the individuals who the study is being done for, with help, guidance from those who maybe have more experience.
And then the last question was, again, a discussion question. Looks like the majority of people said that it would be useful to create a working group to address issues with governance of research in LMICs.
So I think we have like a minute. We can use a minute for the next slide. Oh, no, that's fine. So there was one more QR code which actually would have let you all, can you log in out there to do the global ethics survey? So if you had a minute, you could have gone there.
Yep.
Just go to the last slide. So it won't take longer than, so it'll be the same question. So whichever organization you have a partnership with conducting research, so just answer the questions, putting that partnership's hat in. Just like to, when you go back, you want to see the answers for that and what your thoughts are with conducting global research.
IMC, is that it?
Yeah.
That's what I hear you talking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think once you've got it, you can fill it up at your own time. Thank you for being here,
Yep.
and hope I will be able to put some seats. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.